Welcome to Looks Good to Me, Shipit, a series of in-depth, thoughtful conversations between software professionals, providing insight into the business, craft, and managing a career in software development. If you get any value from this episode, please take a moment to share. It will really help out the show, and it'll let me know which episodes you like versus which episodes you love. Thanks. Now enjoy the interview.
Hopefully this audio will be good enough.
Hopefully it comes through, and if not, we'll have a good one-on-one conversation.
There you go.
And you will get your dream of not being on the internet. So that'll be
it's not that I dream of not being on the internet. I want to share my ideas. I don't necessarily need to share my life, my face, whatever is sort of my thinking.
That actually makes a lot of sense. That's really clear. So, well, let's get started, and they all start the same way. They all start with the same question, which is effectively, tell me about your first memories of technology. What really started your relationship with technology in general, and then computers?
So I'm actually going to go a little bit before what I can honestly claim was mine. My first connection with technology was my father choosing to use 80-column punch cards for my birth announcement.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. My first engagement with it really would have been taking a computer programming class in high school. I don't remember which year it was in high school, but it was the last year that involved doing fortran on punch cards with a 1-week turnaround time to get sent down to the main school district computer, get read in and processed, and come back and tell you that you've been missing a comment in your Hollerith statement. And so you get to spend another week figuring out how to do it. It perhaps gives me more willingness to wait for the computers to take a few seconds to load than other
the
folks.
rest of it. Wow. I had no idea that they were, because my first experience with computing was in grade school. It was on a Commodore 64. I guess I had a bit before that, but that was sort of my first programming experience. And I had no idea that there were punch cards happening in high school. So did you grow up in Silicon Valley then?
I grew up in Seattle.
Seattle. Okay. So a very computer heavy place as well, but
well, no, keep in mind, this was in the late 70s that I was doing my introduction to computer programming. So Microsoft was still a glimmer in Bill Gates's eye.
Oh, wow. That's really cool. So you're in high school, you're learning things, and even that's, I think, something that would be very interesting, and an interesting takeaway for younger programmers to say, like, you don't know how good you've got it. We used to have to, we have to send it a week away in the snow uphill both ways. And
yeah.
So did you love it right away, or where did you go from that spot where you're doing the punch card stuff?
It was a wandering thing for me. The family business, if you will, was chemistry. Both my parents were PhD chemists. In some ways, my earliest memories of computers were going down in the basement of the chemistry building at the University of Washington and seeing the IBM 706s or something like that with their spinning tape drives and lights blinking. I dabbled in it as a thing that was vaguely interesting. I was a chemistry major in college. I took a few computer classes in college, but it was still this side thing. I mean, that was what my school job was when I had one, is working in the computer department, or the computer office. The department then was still just part of math. And it was after college that I went off and worked in Germany for a couple of years, doing a mixture of wet chemistry, computational chemistry, and system management programming, while I figured out what I wanted to do next. And in doing that, I came to realize that I was having more fun doing the computers, that I was interested in it and could do both of them or all three of them, but the computer thing was more interesting. And then I went to graduate school in computer science.
Okay. So
I did that because I still was thinking I wanted to go be a professor, and that was the union card sort of requirement to go do that.
Okay. And so you're in Germany, you're doing the programming and things, you're starting to enjoy it. And that's by then we're probably mid to late 80s.
Mhm.
We're probably on to like the IBM XT and the yellow monochrome screens, or are we still punch cards at this time?
No, so punch cards disappeared from my high school the next year. The next year, they had Commodore 64s in the building and people learned BASIC.
Okay.
I just managed to be in just the right place to suffer through that one. When I got to Germany in 85, there were boxes and boxes of punch cards in various places, but we were largely doing things on 386 machines locally, not Cray, CDC supercomputers or mainframes for the bigger things. And then while I was there, we got one of the early sort of mini supercomputers that was, I guess now you'd think of it as being probably an 8U box, standard 19-inch rack, but it had a couple of disk drives in it and all this weird fancy stuff, and would do vector processing. And we were doing Fortran on that for the computational chemistry stuff.
Okay. So still Fortran, just on what is far more recognizable as a modern computer.
Yeah, it was Fortran assembly language. I learned Pascal in college at some point. I taught it to myself, but it was mostly low-level languages. I remember in the middle of that time, so maybe 86 or so, learning C and thinking, hey, I'm not going to have to learn assembly language anymore. I am just going to be able to program in this high-level language.
Yeah.
It was at least a decade before I really got out of paying attention to assembly language, and the definition of high level is continued to move up the step.
Move up the scale. So, right, I mean, we have no code solutions today, which are,
Yep.
Maybe next year there's something that writes this stuff in AI. At this time, then, what kind of lessons are you gleaning from this time that you might still use today, or things that are of value for people to know about today from this time and phase in your early career?
I think in some ways, the one lesson that I really still take out of that time in Germany that's around computers is that I like to solve problems, and that that was the thing that spoke to me. And it was really where I was beginning to understand I wasn't really that excited by pure research. I think it's an important thing for society, but it's not a thing that I as an individual find particularly important or valuable. And it was really more when I got to graduate school that I started learning a whole bunch of things that I still leverage in a variety of ways. I got to my school at a point when graduate school was very much in the systems space, was very much like an apprenticeship. You were going to be there for 5 or 7 years, and you were sort of going to slave away over the hot stove in the corner and do useful things for your advisor. And then eventually you'd get to pay attention to what you needed to do to get your degree, and then you'd move along. But there were a whole collection of really interesting projects going on. And because it was very much an applied form of systems work, one of the main lessons was they built an operating system called Mach that is actually still buried, or some bits of it are still buried under Mac OS.
Right.
But one of the great decisions that the head of that research project decided to do was to put BSD Unix on top of this research operating system, and then convince the department to use that as the standard operating system for everybody in the department. And that meant that people had to care a lot more about making sure that what they put into the operating system actually was going to work reliably, because otherwise folks would show up with metaphorical pitchforks at your door going, hello, my research project is stuck here because of you. What are you going to do about it?
Right. Okay. And how do you move from where you are? We're in your graduate program now. You're going through this learning. A question I have about this time is modern, maybe not modern education so much as the modern hiring process really goes deep into algorithms. They're so hot on algorithms, like you'd think there was nothing else in the world. Was the education as similarly obsessed with algorithms, or were they just a small thing off to the side? And what was the primary focus of a computing program around that time?
So I can only really speak to there were 4 main areas at Carnegie Mellon, where I went.
Yeah.
Programming systems, which was sort of OS, transaction processing, that level of systems infrastructure sorts of things. Then computer systems, which was really computer hardware, high performance computing, things of that form. AI, which included computer vision and some things of that form. And theory, with robotics being a sort of a fifth lump, somewhat off on the side. And I was in the programming systems area. So that's what I can really speak to it. And this is where I say it was really about, or it felt to me as being applied systems building, that it wasn't because it was being used by people to do other bits of research or another layer of stuff, that it wasn't just purely doing this to write a set of papers and come out with something else. And so there were a few core qualifying exams that you had to take, one in each of the 4 areas, and you needed to pass each of those. And that was sort of the structured education of that program. The rest of it was about figuring out how to do work and research in this area. And that's in the system space. It was very much then. I spent 7 years being a developer and working for somebody else and what they were telling me, but I was learning all sorts of things about it. And there was very little on, I mean, I took a data structures class in college. I took an OS class in college. I have this vague notion there was one more I took, but those are the only formal classes in CS that I've really taken. And yes, I had to prove a program correct as part of the programming systems qual. I understand enough to do those things. But I learned much more there, that there were some people who were really good at building libraries of functionality, and that it was foolish for me to spend my time trying to reinvent that piece rather than going, hey, can I use your library and just do that instead? It's why I fundamentally don't believe in coding in interviews. I think that there is no interesting problem that you can do that is a thing that I'm going to want an engineer to be doing. I mean, Josh Block and the other people behind the Java collection libraries spent months, days, years figuring out how to design them and then how to implement them to be performant on a variety of different hardware. Is it really important to my business to have somebody reinvent the linked list? Probably not. Just go call that one. Or if you're in a different language, go call the utility version from whatever language you use.
Wow.
Don't try to rewrite it. And so getting somebody to do that in an interview is just setting them up to do the wrong thing in my book, or saying that you value they're doing something that you shouldn't be valuing. They're doing in almost any case.
That's I don't think I've ever heard somebody put it that way. And I'm a little mind blown. So you don't have I mean, if you're running an interview, you don't have the programmer program at all? Wow. Sure. Right. That's really quite interesting. And I guess the other thing that I heard there was that the master's level computer science education around the time that you went sounds like, and you said apprenticeship, and you said
But
that
this was a PhD program.
Oh, I'm sorry. So higher, but it was very much a hands-on, very much a practically doing things, and so that's an interesting thing. So if I was to extrapolate, possibly not equivalent, but let's take the example of a boot camp graduate who does their 6-week quick training course, and then they go get a job and they work for, and you said 7 years for your program, and so they work for 7 or 8 years. They probably have a similar experience profile by about 7 or 8 years in, as you did at the end of your PhD. Maybe a little higher level in some places in terms of, but within within spitting distance of each other there. So that's another interesting thing, that there's a great leveling that happens through experience over time, if all of that holds true. So is there anything else major that comes out of your PhD that you would like to share, or can we start talking about when your PhD finishes and what career, how you move into a career from there?
So the one thing that I will point out at the end of that is, having come to the realization that by the time I finished my degree that I wasn't interested in being a professor, the thing that I ended up finding the most valuable about my PhD research is that I built a system that another graduate student used to do their research. And because of what I enabled them to do, they probably finished slightly sooner because of the system that I built. Again, that was a place where I came back and again was building an adaptation layer on it that made it easier for him to take his program and use it on my system without having to learn a bunch of the APIs that I had written the first time I'd done it. And so those are some of the final learnings, again, reinforcing the things that I'd seen people doing earlier.
Yeah.
And
I love that, in the way that it also comes back to the thing that you were saying about, I'm just going to use the Java libraries. This person is going to use my library. And it to some extent reminds me of an author named Werner Vinge, who wrote these stories about 1,000, 10,000 years in the future, where programmers are considered archaeologists for how far down into the libraries they have to go to fix things. And so anyways, so you were about to go on with the next phase of that. So
one of the other pieces that I learned there, and not consciously at the time, but I've reflected back on it since then, is at least one of the professors in the department was utterly low-key about their role in the department. And despite being a full professor, I can remember seeing him sitting on the floor in the office with his graduate students around the office in their chairs, having a conversation. And it was utterly unimportant to him that he was in this low, if you would, low prestige position. And that has sort of framed my, or contributed to my view of being a participant in a conversation and not being interested in trying to leverage a nominal place in a hierarchy to derive reaching an answer or having a discussion.
Right. And that comes around to the selflessness that is highly valued at Netflix, and also probably valuable for me to point out that the reason that we connected was, I was asking a mutual friend of ours, he had said in a discussion context, somebody had said the mythical 10x engineer, and our friend says, oh, they're not mythical, they exist. And so I speak up and I say, well, what is one then? And our friend says, Peter Stout. and so I said, Peter, tell me everything you know. And so we are really trying to glean from you. I think that's one of the lessons we might pick up as the types of behaviors that are high value for a programmer, is to not have that sense of hierarchy, to just get in there, get stuck in, solve the problems. We've already talked about problem solving. And so that's, anyways, so that's a tangent, but it's interesting. And I'm trying to tease out the important parts of what we're learning here. So yeah, so I guess the next question is, so we're at the end of your PhD, and you've discovered or uncovered the fact that you're really not that interested in being a professor. So what do you do then? What do you, like, the world drops out from under you, and where do you go now?
I got married and followed my wife out to the Bay Area, where she got a job at Silicon Graphics back in the day, and sort of worked on getting us settled into our home there for a while when we moved out there, and then started looking around a bit. And she came home from lunch one day and said, you should go look at this company called General Magic. Their CTO came over and gave a talk at there, and what he's describing is more or less what you did your thesis on.
Oh,
it's like, oh, interesting.
That's fun.
So I went and interviewed. I somehow connected with the company and went off and interviewed there. And it's a it was a fascinating and company to work at, and definitely have planted the seeds for the rest of my career after that, both in the sense of the things I worked on, the things I learned there, but also the connections I made. Um,
Yeah.
that. And it also comes down to benefiting from people believing in you. Somebody, one of the things applying for a job in Silicon Valley in the 90s with a PhD is that some places thought that was a good thing, and some places presumed you were going to be too academic and have no idea about how to actually deliver real code. And somebody at General Magic saw something that they believed in and sold the rest of the team on taking a flyer on me.
Yeah.
It's those bits of being open-minded and looking for potential is another thing that I didn't learn consciously at that point in time, but is a thing that I have built up, is that I care much more about curiosity and the potential of somebody to grow into a thing than that they've done it 3 times before.
Right. So that's something that has happened for you, and you're in this sort of almost either a pay it forward sort of way, or you say, well, on reflection, it was a really good idea for them to take that bet, so I should take that bet myself. Right.
Yep.
That's interesting. Now, you've come from academia, you are now in a business environment, already have some hands-on from the style of your Carnegie Mellon education. But what was it like moving into your first real role? I mean, you were
It was just programming. I mean,
yeah.
in that sense, there was, given what I'd done before, there was no, I mean, needed to learn a few different tools or whatever that they happen to have in-house. I had to wean myself off of the particular flavor of C shell that CMU had built internally because they didn't like the stock one, and it had all sorts of whizzy things, and other companies didn't have it, and that
Yeah.
was annoying. But the actual act of writing code was, it's interesting. It was so inconsequential, I had never really thought about it until you asked the question. It was
Right.
like,
Okay. Yeah.
up, I did what I was supposed to do, and
Yeah. So were there any aspects of were the team sizes similar? Were there any aspects of working on multiple simultaneous projects that came out? Like, what are we learning from this phase that might be new? Or
so here's one of the things that has to be pointed out about General Magic. If people are curious, you can go try to see a movie that was made about it. It is, the point the movie makes, it is probably one of the most impactful Silicon Valley companies you've never heard of.
okay.
That the people who founded the company in about 1989 or 1990 came out of Apple's Newton division, and some of their design books from that era show essentially the iPhone from 2007.
Oh, really?
They
Do
were,
you want to get your phone?
no, I don't, but unfortunately, I don't have a way to make it stop other than
Okay.
doing that. But it was a company that was technologically too far ahead of what was really feasible for the point in time. And it was one of the first places that I started to learn about the importance of balancing technical decisions and business realities,
Right.
because the business skills of the company weren't matched with the technical sophistication of the ideas that the company was trying to bring forward. I think they were doing the right thing. They were just 10 years early trying to do it.
Right. And I think especially if you're talking about something like the iPhone. I mean, the iPhone came out in 2007. So if you're building that in 1990, good luck printing out enough touch screens and things, right? Like there's all sorts of challenges there in getting the hardware. But
and that little thing called the internet
yeah.
hadn't really been invented yet. Part of
Yeah.
what we were doing was a proprietary cloud with AT&T, and that was part of what their interest was. And then after figuring out that that wasn't going to work, the company pivoted into doing voice-based user interfaces, and was
So
again,
Alexa.
yes, but again, a decade
Yeah.
plus in front of it. They built a system called Portico that was used to power some of the things that General Motors was doing behind OnStar. Again, mismatch between voice-based interfaces are very easy to demo. Figuring out what the value proposition or the differentiator when selling them to somebody is much harder.
Yeah.
We all are way too tolerant of navigating through phone menu hell to make having a better system really marginally differential in customer perception or something.
Right.
It's so those ended up being the collection of things that I learned out of that point in time, and dealing with the realities of shrinking revenue and needing to downsize companies and potentially spinning out divisions and things like that.
Yeah. So did you wind up riding with General Magic all the way? I assume they went bankrupt at some point then from.
They did eventually go bankrupt. I left before the very end. I sort of got a bit burned out doing all the things, and we were about to have a kid. And so I took some time off, and it's about a year or so after I left the company, they went bankrupt.
Okay. So it's
so done in by the dotcom bust.
I also had an adventure that arose out of that one too. I wound up moving to England after that, so that was, and becoming a high school teacher. So
got it.
Anyways, so okay, so we're, I guess if it was the dot-com bust, we're in 2000 or 1999 or somewhere around there.
2000. So I left there in 2000, and the bust trailed into 2001.
Right. Okay. And you took a year off to enjoy life as a parent. And so what made you start looking again? Or
economics.
Economics. The price of daycare.
We had put away some money. We had not put away enough money. Working for a failing company does not give you enough money to retire in most economic systems.
Shockingly.
Yes.
Yeah.
I interviewed at a variety of small startups and ended up landing at Sun Microsystems in their iPlanet division. Spent 9 months there and was quite frustrated by the fact that I was so far removed from what customers wanted in what I was working on that I couldn't see the chain of people nominally giving me requirements. And for somebody who's becoming clear that I was motivated by solving real problems, having little confidence that the thing that I was working on was actually solving somebody's problem was unsatisfying.
Now, Sun Microsystems was massive at one time. I mean, they were the most impressive computers you could buy. They were.
IBM would probably argue with you, but yes.
Okay, that's true. Okay, as someone who was a kid at the time, I can tell you which ones I thought were the cool ones. And so, outside of that, I assume, because I was at Nortel just around the time that you were at Nortel Networks, they had 130,000 people globally. I imagine Sun was either similar or larger.
Sun was about 40,000 people.
Okay, but still a large thing.
Large, lots of campuses across all over the place. But
and if I'm gonna imagine some other stuff, there's probably a lot of corporate politics and a lot of interdepartmental brinksmanship or things. Or what are the things that you're getting from your time at Sun outside of the not working on direct problems thing?
It was mostly that. The rest of it, because it was 40,000 people, I couldn't figure out how many people were between me and the customer, but I figured it was more than a handful. I have no idea how many people were up the chain, and I was just a peon there.
Yeah.
So awareness of politics or whatnot, not really. It was mostly a sense of, yeah, this is not really what I'm excited by, but it's a paycheck and that's important. It was the bridge until the following summer when I decided to go be employee about number 9 at a startup that I got connected with through people I knew from General Magic. And
Okay.
I spent 5 years at that startup and um,
Okay. Okay.
was employee number 9 or 10, engineer number 4, and that taught me all the usual startup sort of things of, well, what hat am I wearing today? Let's go
Yeah.
get it done. And I also, perhaps driven by my interest in solving problems, sort of remember looking around at what I thought were going to be the most important pieces of the system we were building. And when the CTO said he needed to stop writing a piece, I said, I'll take that. Then spent 5 years more or less working on that, learning the wonders of JBoss and J2EE spec, and why would somebody think that it would make sense to change the implementation of one of the core J2E specs on a point release? No, a patch release, I think it was. It wasn't
Right.
even a point release. They just, yeah, we're going to replace this thing with Jetty or vice versa. And it's like, huh? My system just broke because the spec doesn't actually cover all the things that's
Right. Okay. Has things have gotten better since then? I mean, except I mean, I suspect almost everybody remembers LeftPad, the day that Node.js broke and the entire internet went down because somebody delisted their module that was, 11 lines of code and the internet disappears. So,
yep.
um, but but I mean, if we're talking about J2EE and a patch release break, I mean, that's enterprise level stuff.
Well, but I think this is the place where we were using JBoss, which was open source, and I think that a company came out of it. I don't quite remember the ordering of all of those things around it, but let's say Semver and the ideas around it were not as fully baked at that point in time.
Right.
And
Okay.
so I still think I'd have probably not done it on that level of granularity, but it was less clear that nobody would.
Yeah. I mean, again, so my sort of start in programming was around 99, 98 in terms of professional stuff. And even then, enterprise, people said enterprise like it meant something. They would say, we are writing enterprise software, we are writing business critical systems. And I was working with, this was Ottawa, Canada, where we had a huge engineering school and everybody was wearing little iron rings, and they were very, very keen on this idea that the one thing you never do is break something. And it kind of blows my mind that if we're sitting around in, I guess that's roughly 06 or 07-ish, 2006 or 2007 when
No, the JBoss stuff was probably 3 or 4.
Okay, but even then, it seems like you don't do that to enterprise. You don't. But I guess maybe I'm wrong.
I think the thing is that it never broke our customers because we absorbed that during it broke our development processes.
Yeah.
But doing it as enterprise software meant that you went through a whole sequence of vetting processes before you'd pass it along to your poor unsuspecting customers.
Right. I mean, but it's also shocking to me that JBoss would do it to you, because I would have thought that they were.
I think that this gets into the places that Sun would have been selling their J2EE implementation to the real enterprises, not to the small startups like us. And they would have come with a different level of, I mean, Sun's application server had certainly a different level of certification and much more rigor about versions and whatnot.
Right.
And so maybe this is as much you get what you pay for.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I can understand that. Yeah, it's like, yeah, yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense to me. So you're at the startup for about 5 years, learning about you just do what has to be done at any given time. There's no real job titles. Quite indicative of the start of your career as well. So it's this, I mean, it's the same sort of thread we see playing through. At what point are you deciding that it's time for you to move on from there? What is the thing that gets you to move?
One of the small companies I interviewed at in the fall of 2001 when I was looking around was a little company called Google, and they weren't interested in me at the time. All I can remember about the technical phone screen was something about placement of data on disks, and it really felt like it was some problem that my phone screener was struggling with that day. So he figured he'd ask the schmo on the other end of the line. I was clueless about it, and that was all that wrote. But I had a friend from graduate school who'd subsequently gone on to Sun and the Java stuff, who'd then gone to Google, and he'd been nagging me to apply there. And so it was as much, I don't know whether I was conscious that the company was sort of starting to go down the downslope of it, or whether I was intrigued by the possibility or whatnot, but it was somebody suggesting I do this other thing.
Yeah.
And in hindsight, I am fairly self-reflective, and so many of the lessons of my career come later on when I go back and I think about things. And if I was really optimizing my career or the economics of my career, I probably would have left the startup at about year 3 or so.
Right.
That's where you could start to see the company did a really good job of figuring out how to get into its first market. It didn't figure out how to get into the second market. And that was the thing that basically the breadth of what it could do in that first market became saturated. And then it was like, well, what now what? And I think that was figured with the transparency within the company. I could have figured that out at about year 3. I think I learned a bunch of things in those last couple of years, particularly that last year, that I've leveraged since then. That was the first place that I started becoming more conscious about how do you talk about a technical problem in business terms so that the company will choose to invest in it. If we do this work refactoring the system in this way, when we go do the deployment at our next customer, it should involve less work of this, that, and the other form. So maybe that's trying to make lemonade out of lemons. Maybe it's just being a thoughtful person, but those are the things that I got out of the
right. So that seems like a really valuable skill in terms of this power to influence from a individual contributor seat, where you go to your manager or your director or whoever the decision maker is, and instead of sort of shaking your fists and saying the code is bad and it's hard to work with, you say this translates directly into dollars and cents, and this is why we should invest X hours. $10,000 worth of hours is going to save us $100,000 on our next deployment, and anybody can connect those dots, right? And so that's a really powerful skill that happens at some point in a developer's career, hopefully, if they stick it out, right?
I think it depends on what the path is of the developer. I think that when I was at General Magic was the first time that I started to rise up the ladder and away from the keyboard. And I remember at that point in my career, quite literally thinking they will pry the keyboard out of my cold, dead hands, that I still got too much out of coding something in a day. And so the idea of being in meetings, trying to sell people, even if it meant traveling to Australia and doing something like that, which I did get to do, that wasn't going to be what got me up in the morning. And for some people, that's never going to be what gets them up in the morning. I think it is important to learn and value what those things are. How do we get people into positions where they are enjoying what they're doing, valued for what they're doing, and are valuable to the company that they're working for. And that can be a different thing for me, for you, for somebody sitting next to you. That doesn't make either of our career paths or career choices right or wrong, but it's just a thing. There was a discussion in the leadership community that we're both part of, or one of them that we're both part of, about how people think about their careers recently. I didn't comment on this there. The thread sort of petered out and I didn't feel like digging it back up. That for 18 years, my career was designed around wanting to be home to have dinner with my wife and daughter, and to be able to go to all of the events that my daughter was doing, and that I didn't want to commute a long distance if I had to drive it. If I could take a train, that was a different matter. And those were the things that drove, quote unquote, my career, rather than, is my title progressing? Is my salary doing anything X, Y, or Z? That's not going to be right for everybody, but it was absolutely right for me.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really nice. I like that. I like that. That's good. So, you said you went on to a small startup, I think Goose. Are they still around today?
I think they're still around. I spent a couple of years there.
Yeah.
And in some sense, I could have retired there.
Yeah.
And this was really a thing that I thought about. I was working in the storage infrastructure division, a bunch of fundamental technology enabling a bunch of things. But at that point in time, and I think they've learned some things since then, Google was really effective and efficient at hiring people relatively earlier in their career to be a cog in the machine. And they were becoming more effective at hiring name people and sort of quasi hanging them up on the wall as a sort of a set of trophy heads. The collection of people in the middle, like me, with 10, 15, 20 years, depending on how you want to count it, of experience, who had been working in particular domains, they didn't know what to do with as much. Right. My phone screen with them involved a conversation with a front-end engineer about HTML and HTTP and a bunch of things. I'm a distributed systems back-end infrastructure person by training. I have enough interest in that at that point in time, because I probably had 3 to 5 times more experience than this person did. I could answer all their questions, but I could also then go back to the friend who'd carried my resume in and said, look, if you really want this to go someplace, you need to go talk to your recruiters, or I'm going to end up in the weeds someplace, because that was that pointless phone screen. Yeah. And the other end of that is, so I went through the rest of it, did the interview, got an offer. My family was taking a road trip, and I got a phone call from somebody at Google trying to figure out where to place me. Because they don't hire you for a particular team. And I was like, SRE, this storage infrastructure team, and I think some front-end UI sort of thing. I don't remember exactly what it was.
Sorry to interrupt. SRE, site reliability engineer, existed at that time? This is 06 or 07-ish?
07. Right? Oh, yeah. That was a big thing.
I've only heard the term SRE quite recently. I mean, within the last, there we go. I've learned something else.
No, there were lots and lots of SREs at Google in 07. I couldn't tell you how much farther back than that it goes, but I would guess multiple years, 5 or more wouldn't surprise me. But given the degree that they were embedded in all sorts of things, 2 or 3 at the very least. So
interesting. Okay, well, it's interesting. Okay, I'm sorry to have cut you off there, but you were sort of trying to find your place. You were trying to find your place at Google.
This person was looking at me as a cog, and they were trying to put me in the machine. And I said, look, I can do any of those. I think I'm going to be most valuable doing that storage infrastructure thing. That fits in with. And they went around, talked about the other ones. And, you sure you're not willing to do the SRE thing? I said, I'm willing to do it. I'm just saying over yonder. And it was also, if you went and looked at the promo things, they were very much written in terms of greenfield development. What are you doing to do something new? And my habit, tendency, is to do what Tanya Riley describes as glue work. Roy Rappaport has described me as being a dike plugger. I go to the blank spots in the board and say, hey, I think something needs to be here, and help that. And sometimes that's a greenfield thing. Sometimes that's just sort of getting the chewing gum and baling wire and pulling the fence segments together and fastening it up a little bit. That wasn't a thing that fit into that framework. And Google, as they hire you, says, hey, we think we're going to put you at this level, but we're not going to promise that we'll actually put you at that level we'll make that, we'll really nail that down in a year or 18 months. And basically my longevity was tied there to sort of playing that game out for a while, and then getting clear with my boss that no, they were going to actually knock me back down a level because I hadn't done enough of these other things.
I mean, rubrics and checklists and sorts of I've only read about, I've never been at Google, so I've only read about it, but it does sound very depersonalized measurement that is it doesn't feel like there's, from what I've read, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of qualitative assessment, and it is very much in a checkbox for has done this check. And
so I can't tell you the mechanics. It was entirely opaque to me.
Yeah.
But the tea leaves, and my boss was being clear enough with me that I could understand what the Ouija board or the magic 8-ball was saying or going to say. And so when the VP of engineering from the first startup I was at reached out to me for a reference for somebody else, he said, oh, by the way, if you're interested, I'd be happy to carry your resume into this company I'm working for now. And sure. And it was also one of those situations where the importance of connections matters. I could have kept working there and found a way. And intellectually, it was a fascinating place to be. The tech talks that would come in, the problem spaces you were working in were really interesting. But about that point in time, a variety of the people on the team that I was working on moved on to other projects or other things. And so my sense of connection, even to that local team,
even that vanished a little.
Or diminished. And that made it very easy for me to go, yeah, sure, let's have coffee and we'll talk about that.
Okay. So before we move to the next place, I mean, Google is a pretty big logo. We know that they have sort of world-class engineering. I'd like to take a little bit more time to talk about what sorts of new things did you pick up about working and I guess there's this glue work aspect of it. And did you find a way to start introducing that in your space at Google, or what
I was doing it, so I wasn't necessarily introducing it. I just was doing it. It just wasn't necessarily very valued on the things that I learned there. I don't know whether anybody talks about it anymore. Testing on the toilet.
Okay, I don't even know what that is. So what is that?
So back in 2007, and I think it had started a while before that, people once a week would go print out these flyers and put them on the doors or whatnot in the bathrooms with little tidbits about testing and how to do it better. And it was called Testing on the Toilet because they knew where people were going to be periodically, and they put a little reading material in front of folks. And it was a place that the value of testing as a structured and formalized investment became clearer to me.
Okay.
There are a whole collection of strategies that they helped me to understand the why of them better. Formalizing testing, having a common way of building and testing code, having the code review process in a standard and regularized way. Those all combine to enable them to have this cog-like system for their engineers, because it makes it easier for people to move around, because you know that when you get to the next team, they're going to build and test things the same way. The set of tests that are going to run will be different, but you have zero startup cost to go figure out how to do it. Same commands you knew yesterday will work today, and you can be productive. And so the cost of enabling people to move around is much lower, so you can get fertilization and you can do growth opportunities in that way. And that is an immensely valuable thing if you view that as a value proposition for your engineering organization.
Right. Wonderful. So around this topic of testing, I wouldn't expect you to run down the, well, I mean, maybe if you can encapsulate the top 5 rules or whatever, I would love to hear those, just so we have a little more sense on the detail of the testing. Or if we could find a way to point to some resources or books that people could dig into a little more on that, because that sounds useful.
It was a work in progress that I happened to have had the opportunity to work with one of the early people in it, but they had developed a year or two earlier the concept of test mercenaries, who were basically people who would embed in a team to help them to adopt this practice, to figure out how to do this. And they had very simple systems to enable understanding what your code coverage was, seeing whether your builds were red or green. And at Google, having a red build was a big deal. You went and fixed that because you didn't know, because of the way all the things worked, you didn't necessarily know what impact that was going to have across the company, because Google, in order to get reproducible builds at that point in time, built everything effectively from source all the time. They then built a really amazing build system that actually, based off of Perforce version numbers and other things, would optimize and go, oh, I actually have already built this part of the tree over where here's the cache, I can just pull that out. And so it was designed to build the whole thing, and it just optimized the heck out of that, so your builds actually were relatively bounded in time. But that meant that if your build broke and it was checked in on mainline elsewhere, random other folks were going to be calling you sooner or later going, I can't build my thing because your thing is...
Yeah, much like your experience from the 80s, where somebody checks something into BSD and then they get the researchers knocking on their door saying, what's the problem here? Why did you do that, idiot?
Yep.
That's okay. That's really interesting. And I love this concept. So if I was at I am at a startup, but if I was watching this and I was at a startup, one of the things that I might take away is if we brought in a testing expert to sit down and not write our tests, but force us to write tests and coach us on how to do it effectively, that might increase our performance in deployment and going forward. That
you have to, there was some blurb I saw in Apple News a while back about some business coach making the point that you have to work with somebody. He won't work with people who aren't interested in growing. And it is very difficult to get people to believe in testing if they don't already believe it. If they think it's an important thing, or your corporate culture has mandated that it is important to their continued employment to care about it, fine. Then bringing somebody in to help them to understand how to do it effectively. No, you're not necessarily trying to get 100% coverage. How do you understand what you're trying to get? What are the ways that, because one of the things that I value out of valuing testing is it changes the way that I write code.
right.
So that it becomes more pluggable, more testable. I don't have to do as much as flaky integration tests, because the bigger surface area, the flakier it's just going to be, that I can do more of it in pieces as unit tests or system tests in a smaller sandbox. But to make that possible, you have to think about how you're designing your software. And so one of the things that I do regularly interview for when I'm interviewing engineers is I will ask about their testing strategies, and then I'll ask them whether testing influences the way that they write software. Just like I will ask them, have you ever had to support a system that you built? If so, has that experience influenced the way that you write your code? Because A, I'm curious about those particular areas, but B, I'm interested, are they reflective, self-reflective, and learning from their past experiences? Because if the answer to either or both of those is that they do them, but they haven't really done anything different from it, that's not a great signal.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I remember I was hot on testing, but at an agency world where we don't necessarily budget for writing tests, you can sit around all day. I mean, there was this one time where I was writing an app for a mobile phone, and I was writing unit tests, and I was so proud of myself that I'm writing these unit tests, and I'm saying, and I wound up telling my manager or the project manager, I say, oh, I'm writing tests for this, so our QA is going to be a breeze. And not an hour later, I was pulled into an office with no windows and a closed door, and my manager and this PM sitting on the other side of the table staring at me, and they say, stop writing the test.
So to go back to one of the things we talked about earlier, that becomes the place to talk about the business value.
Yeah.
Are we going to continue to use this code? Am I going to need to refactor it to make it work for a different customer in the future?
Yeah.
How do I have confidence that I'm not going to break it? By having those unit tests, I have better ability to refactor it and make those changes with a bounded investment, a bounded incremental investment to put in that new feature without having to revalidate the whole thing.
Yeah. And so,
but not everybody buys that.
Yeah. And also, if I was less of a young hothead at the time, I may have delivered the message a little better.
There was a topic that came up, and I don't know whether I can quite remember. The foolish don't learn from their mistakes. The smart learn from their mistakes. The wise learn from other people's mistakes.
Yeah. I like that. That's good.
Yeah.
So here we are. Let's move back to we're doing the networking. We have a friend who's a VP, carries your resume into a.
He was just a leader. He'd been the VP at the startup. He was he was a director at the next company.
Okay, so you went and what was this transition like? What was it like to leave Google? What was it like to start at this new one? How did your career change there?
First time it was easy to tell somebody explain to somebody what the company I worked for was doing. My daughter was very little when I was at Google, and years later, she fessed up to the fact that she thought my job at Google was to answer the questions that people were typing in the search box. So it's like, okay, cool.
Yeah, that's good.
See, I went to work for a company that was famous for shipping red envelopes around.
So hold on, let me work out the timeline then. Are we in 2009-ish?
Spring of 2009.
That's right around the start, isn't it?
No, the company was 10 years old at that point.
Oh, okay.
So, but this is the point why I described it. I went to work for a company that was famous for shipping red envelopes.
Yeah.
This was back in the day of DVDs as king. The company was about 10 million subscribers about the time that I did that, with probably close to a 10-to-1 ratio between people doing DVDs and streaming at that point in time.
Okay.
The early days, so the company goes back to, I can never remember, it's either 98 or 99 is when it was founded.
I didn't realize that.
But they built shipping the DVDs, were very good at that. By the time I started, they had started exploring doing streaming at least back to 2006. The first PC player was shipped in 2007, I think it was, and the first games console was supported in 2008, the Xbox. It was starting to be a thing, but it was in some ways, streaming was a little bit of a startup grafted onto the side of this public company doing the other things. There were a handful of engineers working on the playback systems, which is the team that I went into. All of streaming was probably 40 or 50 people. But the whole company at that point in time, Netflix has always operated in a lean fashion, was probably 300 to 700 people. I don't really know. I mean, it was one of those things. I mean, these days, the number of employees is in the quarterly report. Back then, it was always I don't know how many people are in the conference room here, right?
Yeah.
And there was another office down in LA. We were having to buy
and Mike's on vacation today, so we got to add one for that. So yeah.
So in that sense, it was going from a big corporation back to a much smaller setting. It was not a startup in that how long is this paycheck and thing really going to stick around? What's the viability? But there were challenges,
Yeah.
and it was an opportunity to grow with that organization. I came in as a line engineer doing all sorts of things there. And as I spent 4 years there in that stint, and by the time I left the organization, the engineering part of the organization had grown to be 40 people.
Right.
And the boss who'd been a manager had become a director, and a bunch of my peers had become managers reporting to him. And I was still reporting to him as a cross-functional IC role. We don't have titles in the engineering. We don't really have an engineering ladder. And so there was no changing my title, but I was definitely operating at a staff plus sort of level.
Okay. Yeah. So I think one of the things that strikes me as interesting, I have read some of the early stories of Netflix, and I don't know if you saw the Ryan Burgess interview where I did a lot of research for that. And so the keeper test was a thing at the time when you joined already. And one of the things, and I don't know where to ask the question, so I thought I feel like this is a good spot. What are the things? I mean, you've been at Netflix now for how many years? 10 years?
11 of the last 12 years.
11 of the last 12 years. So, oh, interesting. So there's a spot where you disappear and come. Okay, I can't wait to hear that. But so you've had a very good track record of passing the keeper test, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for anybody watching who hasn't read through all of the documents, the keeper test is effectively, well, why don't you tell me what that is? And then tell me how you made it through for 11 years.
Well, I'd actually be curious to hear your description of the keeper test.
Sure. Okay.
Because I'm always curious to hear what people outside of the company, how they perceive it.
How they perceive it. So my take in the reading is the keeper test is if this person came to me today and said they were leaving, would I fight to make sure that I did everything I possibly could to keep them, right? Mm-hmm. And that's sort of what they describe. But what are the factors and behaviors that go into making somebody, like, let's ask it two ways, because there's the fact that you've passed it for 11 years. Yep. And there's the other fact that you've probably had to make the call that somebody is or is not a keeper, mm-hmm. right? And so what are the behaviors that engineers exhibit that make them the type to say, I've got to have this one on my team for as long as I possibly can? What makes somebody super, anyway, so what makes them a keeper?
So I think it is no one thing. And that's part of why I wanted you to frame the question, to sure. hear that thing. There is no one, this is the checklist of things that makes you a keeper and that person not a keeper. It's fundamentally, it comes down to, does your boss perceive you as being valuable to the successful execution of their team, their organization, to delivering on what the business needs? And I sort of am an existence proof that I have de facto passed that for all of those years. But that doesn't mean that I don't frequently deal with imposter syndrome, or the way I described it internally to a bunch of people, I have a more or less annual existential crisis about whether or not I am providing value to the company. And part of that comes from having a non-standard role. It's much easier in some sense if you're looking at an engineer who's being asked to deliver features, design a bigger thing, sort of whatever scale of hands-on coding sort of engineering you want to talk about. Are they doing it well, timely, etc.? Are they solving the right problems? Those can be things that you can pay attention to. When you start to get into squishier cross-functional things, and particularly if you don't particularly have an engineering ladder, then, well, what exactly is successful? And so maybe it's kind of like it's the Dread Pirate Roberts.
Right. Oh, I'll most likely kill you in the morning.
Exactly. And at least early on, I think that all of us as individuals were, by and large, much harder on evaluating ourselves than each other or the company was on evaluating us. That Netflix and its culture attracted people who were self-reflective, trying to grow, trying to be better at what they're going to do. And that leads to be people who often have self-doubts, wonder if they're really doing enough and all those sorts of things. And so they come together. I've never actually had, I mean, and this is the other piece of it. I have never explicitly had a conversation around whether or not I'm a keeper with any of my managers.
Right.
And I get regular feedback on what I'm doing well or not doing well from my bosses at various points in time. So I have, this is not to say that that feedback culture is not happening and alive and well, but that ends up being the thing, is that most people don't have that conversation, I think, most of the time. And so that's the other piece, that the external perception is perhaps that is a weekly, monthly, quarterly thing that a boss sits down and kind of goes, eh.
Will I fire you today?
Right, shall I fire you today? And given that one of the things that goes with this is it should never be a surprise to somebody that they get fired by Netflix.
Yeah.
That's not a thing that you can wake up like the Dread Pirate Roberts and decide to fire somebody today. You need to have talked to them, pointed out what you think are the things that they aren't doing well, engage in trying to help them to do better, or at least understand what are the things that they need to figure out how to do better. Different answers on that part at different points in Netflix's lifespan.
Okay. So here we are now. So I guess we're going to talk about the first 4 years at Netflix, and then we'll talk about this little gallivant you had,
Yep.
which I'm excited to hear about. I don't know what this is. So let's talk about, so you're coming in at Netflix. It's this new thing. You're building this 40-person team. It's growing. What are the things that you're picking up in this time? And yeah, what are the things you're picking up? And maybe I'll ask questions based on what we hear.
I was learning about context, not control, and learning it in the way little kids learn, in a just sort of living the culture, watching it happen, going, oh, that's what that is. And it's only really in the last 6 months or a year that I've really been doing a bunch of reflection and internal thinking about how to tell the story of how I see the difference between it. But to me, it's not in the first sentence. The first sentence of context and control can be the same thing. We are going to move to the cloud. If you stop there, that's control. If you then put the paragraph on, we're going to move our infrastructure to the cloud because we don't think that operating our own hardware data centers is a material investment or competitive advantage for us. It distracts us from the other things that we think have higher value, blah, 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 blah. That turns it into context.
Right.
The way it becomes even more effective is when you add a question onto the end of it, such as, we've got no clue how to get our systems out of our data centers to the cloud. Would you please go figure out how to do that? Thundering herd out the door to the whiteboards to go figure out what all this fun is going to be as engineers get excited and go figure out how to do it. That is highly impactful, highly effective leadership and context.
Okay. Okay. So where is that decision made then?
10 years on, I can't tell you exactly who made the decision. I assume it was some collection of Reed Hastings, Neil Hunt, who was our chief product officer at the time, maybe a couple of other people on the board or the CXO level. I don't really know. It just sort of Neil or somebody else in the senior leadership brought engineering together and said, hey, boys and girls, that way.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So, but I mean, the broader question there becomes, where are all of these other decisions made? Like, I know there are a lot of microservices. So how did we decide, Netflix, your royal we, not me, but like, how did we decide that we're going to go from whatever we had before into microservices? How did we decide, oh, we're going to go move to GraphQL? And, how are these things, or are there working groups?
So at the point in time that we started this migration, there were 6 or 7 server-side engineers on streaming. In some sense, streaming was the guinea pig that went first because it was less risky than all the other stuff. So a bunch of us sat down and kind of scratched our heads about the non-streaming side was more or less one big Java monolith. There were a few other bits and pieces, and recommendations was a C++ application, as I recall. Streaming was a couple of three Java services that I can remember off the top of my head. And we kind of sat down and said, all right, what do we do with these things? And much of it was, first, a small team went off to sort of go bootstrap the lowest layers of things. We were going into AWS. There was no standardized way to find other instances. So some people built an RPC layer that built what we called our discovery service into that, and sort of got that bootstrapped over a number of months before anybody else came along. It was like, because at the point that we were starting to go down that path, we were also dealing with the shorter term tactical thing of, we've only got one data center. We think that's a bad idea. We need to stand up the second data center. And so that was a shorter term tactical effort that got executed over the course of some chunk of 2009. And while somebody in the background is working on laying the beginnings of maybe if you will, they were the surveying crew going out and figuring out, oh, we're going to go over this hill, not that one, and those sorts of things. And then we started porting the main server onto that stuff and started deploying it. And then we figured out how to leverage different endpoints, host names that different pieces of our client population were using to move things incrementally, and tunnels to route traffic back from the cloud to the data center or the other way. I don't remember. We probably went both directions at different times. So how do you peel this onion? Lots of incremental investment. And it was just a bunch of engineers. Keep going forward. No, yes, you'll make some mistakes, but keep going forward. And this is all while building out new features, adding on new client systems, et cetera, et cetera.
So it sounds like it's a very organic growth process, and the team very loosely coupled, and everybody says, "Oh, I think I can handle this. I'm going to go do something." Then I'll tell you if it works or something like that.
It was a little more structured than that, in that there was a team that was set off to go do this thing of figuring out the base level.
Right.
And we had product review, program review meetings with the head of product to talk about how we were going to do things. So the ideation was all happening at the bottom, but there were grown-ups, if you will, paying at least some attention to what the kids were doing.
Right. Okay. That's really interesting. So,
but it was a case of, this is the case where having a very clearly articulated, we are doing a streaming service, to created a lot of low effort alignment through the organization, in that, okay, is this thing that I'm working on going to help the streaming product move forward by being in the cloud or adding on this feature that we need for this other thing? How do I make those trade-offs? Very clean and clear.
Yeah. Okay. So we're 4 years in. Is there anything about this phase that you feel we should really talk about?
There's, at some point on one side or the other of this detour, as you're referring to it, there's some learnings to be talked about. I don't care. Well, that relate to the end of that time, but I don't care what order we do them in.
Okay. Well, let's pick the learnings up on the other side, because this one's just for me. I'm excited about. So you're at Netflix, you're having a good time. What coaxes you away?
A former coworker who I respected a lot asked me to go have coffee, and
it's always coffee.
I think it was actually lunch, to be precise. She had left and gone to some company, and then it ended up at this startup, which by the time I landed there was 50 odd people. So it was well on its, much bigger than the first one I went to. And because we both worked for the same boss, I told my boss I was going to have lunch with her, and wasn't particularly looking to go anywhere else. But it proved to be the seed for some very thoughtful conversations with my boss at the time about sort of what I was interested in doing, where I thought I was going to go. at that point in time in my career, I could look at my time at smaller companies as being the things I'd found more satisfying than my time at bigger companies. And I therefore thought that going back to a startup would give me some skills that would enable me to be a division architect or something, or a chief architect at a smaller, medium-sized thing, which is sort of what I thought I was aiming at that point in time, in a very fuzzy kind of way. And talking about what he thought I might do if I stayed at Netflix and all that collection of things. And it ended up being, I think it's better for my career, or how I envisioned my career, to go to that startup. And a bunch of former Netflix people were there. And so I thought it might be kind of Netflix-like. Like, cool, let's go do that. I ended up spending 14 months there and shipped the 1.0 product, learned a whole bunch of things, and ended up deciding that it wasn't going to continue to be the right place for me to be going forward. Since I'd left Netflix on good terms and had enjoyed being there, I reached back out to a few of the people I knew at the company and interviewed again, and ended up coming back into the precursor of the job I have now.
Okay. So let's talk about the things you learned at this. I'm going to be the chief architect startup. What are we?
So to be clear, I was just going in as a principal engineer there, but I thought it would be things that would teach me about how to be going in that direction. So what did I learn? Let's start on the things I learned about what I hadn't done as well as I thought I had at the end of my first time. I had been organizing a bunch of lunches between the team I was on and adjacent teams, trying to build relationships, connect to people technically. I thought I had been more effective at getting those to be ongoing and that they would keep going after I left. I discovered that they had largely not kept going. And that led one particular project to fall through the cracks, and a bunch of context to get lost in ways that took a long time to sort of deal with. And whether we really fully have or not is probably debatable, but it means that I'm much more interested in trying to create self-sustaining communities rather than ones where it is my presence that results in their continuing,
moves them forward. So just so I can clarify, that's the story. So at Netflix, you had set up these recurring lunches, and you thought those would keep going. You said, well, they're easy. The meeting's already booked. You just go. That's all you have to do. But apparently without you there.
Well, I don't think I think the process was, I didn't just leave it on everybody's calendar going forward. And I was probably curating them a little bit to fit them into schedules based on whatever, rather than just having an infinite recurring thing.
Right. Okay. And
even so that might have helped. I don't know.
Yeah. And so that's one of the things you learned about on that side. And
now what did I learn about the startup? What did I learn? I learned just because a bunch of people come from one company does not necessarily mean that will shape the company, the culture of another company. It depends on who's in a position of influence and things of that form. The startup ended up with much more of a Microsoft style structure. Part of what that led to.
Can I ask, what are you defining as a Microsoft? Because there's is that
Satya Nadella?
So there's him where they had these things called like engineering rank order, and you sort of fire the person in position number 5, or
no, this is much more about how you partition responsibilities into different organizations. Nothing about the stack ranking or any of that stuff, but much more about Netflix has historically had product management, engineering management, ICs inside of engineering. And that meant that there was a variety of things around project or program management that would fall into either engineering managers or IC's realm of responsibility. Microsoft has a much clearer investment in a PMO organization and things around that. And so that ends up meaning that the shape of a technical IC is different. it's not necessarily better or worse. It's just a different scope of things that are going to be on your plate versus at a company like, not in a Microsoft style company, or maybe more generally, it would be at a company with a significant investment in a PMO organization is going to be different than at a company that doesn't have that. And I don't think of myself as being particularly good at project management, but I have come to realize that I do and have done over the years a bunch of project or program management as part of it. And it's been interesting to get into discussions recently with various people who find the difference between what senior ICs do and what technical program managers do to be more ambiguous than I had thought about historically. So I'm still digesting that one. Because to some people, I'm starting to get the sense that a senior technologist is about somebody who's deep vertically, if you will, in a domain. And if you look more broad, now you're really starting to look like a technical program manager rather than, well, that's just a different form of being a senior IC.
Right.
Again, I don't know that there's a right or wrong, but it's sort of one of those got to think about that things.
Right. Yeah.
And so the combination, and then the other thing that came out of that is realizing that there were probably a couple of years of growth of the engineering organization at that startup before it would get large enough that the role that I was really interested in would exist, which is I wasn't aiming to be the VPE, Vice President of Engineering, or the CTO yet. I was aiming to be sort of that one notch down for a subspace of it kind of thing. And that really needs, I think, someplace between 50 and 150, 200 engineers, I think. I don't really know. I haven't seen enough companies at exactly that stage to know where it shows up, but smaller than that, the CTO is sufficient, or you have a CTO and a VPE, and that covers everything. And where do you need that one more person to really be doing that? Someplace in there. I couldn't, sort of having learned from past startups, I was like, I don't see this growth curve happening in the time frame that it's worth my
sticking around.
Amount of time I'd be doing just coding things, which were interesting. I loved the problem we were trying to solve, but wasn't clear that that was really growing me, and that was what led me to go back to Netflix.
Okay.
I've got one more lesson on that one too for you.
Okay. Well, let's hear the lesson, but I have a question.
Sure.
I want to make sure that I understand what a chief architect is.
No, this is my point. I was only vaguely going this. This is like
no.
To go back to the one of the most important interviews that I ever did for a job I didn't get was back in 2001 in the dotcom bust. I interviewed at a small startup, and I talked to the CEO, and he asked the usual, what do you want to be when you grow up sort of question. At that point in time, my answer was clear and simple. I want to be a CTO.
Yeah.
Did I really know what a CTO was? Probably not. He gave me the advice that I should open up my mind to exploring more things on the way there. That might be where I ended up, but by trying more things along the way, I could figure out that there might be something else that would interest me more, and or I would be better at being a CTO for having taken slightly less of a straight line towards it. And sadly, in hindsight, I should have made sure I remembered his name and tried to stay connected with him. That was a little bit before LinkedIn, so that wasn't quite as easy, because I wonder in hindsight, could I have learned a bunch of other interesting things by maintaining that relationship?
Someone on the leadership community we are in recommended a book called The Leadership Pipeline to me, and it has that exact same lesson where so they break down the life cycle of a manager from, manager of ICs to a manager of managers, then to a manager of managers, a manager, and all the way up, and it gives you the right name. And it says, if somebody comes up and they get into level 4 or whatever, up in that stage, and they skip a stage, we actually have to enforce training to backfill those skills that they missed on the way up. So sounds like a similar lesson around why would you go straight to CTO if you haven't done frontline manager and things like that. So that's an interesting take, and it's echoed in other literature as well.
You have no idea how happy you make me by talking about the leadership pipeline, because I suspect I may have passed that book along to our mutual recommender.
Oh, it's great. It is great. It really is good. I mean, it's a little old.
Yep.
It feels a little
So am
dated.
I.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, I mean, you're a little older than me, but I feel quite old some days too. And the other thing that gets me about the book is it was written at a time, I guess, where it was acceptable to use he in the position, and so I didn't quite like that. But everything else is interesting, and if you just cringe a little every time they. Sorry, I muted myself there, but yeah,
I was going to say, what happened?
Yeah. So, but it is a really great book. Let's skip back now to the other thing you said you learned. You said there was one more thing to learn, and then we'll go back to Netflix.
So this is the thing I learned on the other side as I got back to Netflix. Two different things. One is my leaving gave Netflix an opportunity to grow and to develop an awareness independently that it needed or was interested in having somebody focus on some of the problems that I was interested in taking on. And
Right.
so it gave it the ability to get there independently. The other thing, and this is the one I really didn't understand as a value proposition, but I think it was really helpful, is going away for a year gave me the ability to let go of some things, both in the sense of things that had been frustrating me a little bit that I didn't necessarily be doing them every day, I didn't understand had been a frustration. And it also allowed me to create a distance between some of the systems that I had been directly working on previously, so that I was respected and understood to have context, but I could be seen as somebody who was speaking from the outside of any particular system, and therefore working towards the good of the company, not necessarily having a particular axe to grind on a topic.
Yeah.
It was occasionally amusing to have an engineer tell me about some system and blah, blah. It's like, just FYI, yeah, I wrote that.
I wrote
so,
it.
like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
This led me to get somebody who built the White Pages application that we had there, which at the time only looked at the start date of the person. And I asked them if they could stitch together around that for the people like me who'd been there. So when people looked me up in it, boomerang. So when people looked me up, they could go, oh, he knows a bit more than just having been here 2 months might suggest. So.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess this is the phase from then to present day. So we're the last 6 years, I guess we are. 7 years. What an explosion you've had. I mean, it seems like it's gotten a lot bigger. Now, here's a question just about that. The first thing you learned, you said it gave Netflix the time and opportunity to grow. Would it have happened if you had stayed?
Oh, I'm sure it would have grown.
Yeah.
But what I don't know is, thinking back on the low grade things that were frustrating me, would those have frustrated me enough that I might have wandered off to something else? Basically,
right. Yeah.
If you view when I came back as being 5 and change years after I first got there, would I at that point, because I've never been more than 5 years anyplace other than Netflix, would I have wandered off into some other job at that point in time? And so that's the way that I think it's been beneficial for both of us.
So talk about the other things that you've picked up in the last 6 years then, because I mean, so much is going on there, and one of the biggest systems in the world nowadays. So
I've learned I do program management. The first thing I did was to work on a project program called Global Cloud, which set up the traffic management style that we use today, through to today, for dealing with regional issues and the like, to mitigate them. And that was an 18-month journey that was breaking it down into a couple of sort of 6-month phases and getting people along for the journey, remembering that just because phase 1 went really well didn't mean that you could get away for free with talking to people about phase 2, or maybe it was phase 3 where I made that boo-boo. The most reliable teams that I'd been working with, it delivered everything exactly. And I got a little sloppy on just sending the vague reminder email. And I and the person who was point for that team got into a meeting one day, and we're both kind of, oh, oops, we'll get that.
Yeah.
It all got taken apart, but it's like, no, just because things are moving smoothly, you don't get to forget about checking the oil level in the motor, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah. So you said you were sort of equivalent to staff-ish when you left and you came back. Are you still in that zone, or is there?
Netflix historically had a quarterly meeting called QBR, Quarterly Business Review. And I felt that for the things that I was interested in doing, that being able to attend that would be valuable and make me more valuable to the company. To attend that, you had to be a director or above. And so I asked for and pushed on getting a director title. Since I wasn't leading a team, for better or worse, I decided to throw technical director in the front of it. I should have done something else, because it turns out when you start making content, you discover that in the content creation world, a technical director is, loosely speaking, as a non-studio technology person, a senior software engineer who has domain knowledge of some aspect of creating content. Creates a little bit of confusion inside the company when you have people with that title in a different part of the organization showing up, and other folks are going, "You're a what?
Yeah.
Are you talking to me?" Just trust me, it's a different thing. Participating in those business discussions absolutely made a difference to the value that I could bring to the organization.
Okay.
And so, what is it? I don't know. Principal engineer is just,
Okay.
it has historically been a different thing. One of the things that I did along the way on my journey is I managed teams a couple of times. The first time, my boss at the time fired one director and then had another one quit to go to a startup. And he said, "You know how you've mentioned in the past, but if I got into a pinch, you'd be willing to manage."
Yeah.
Now it's like,
Now,
cool.
now, please. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll
Okay.
take that one. And he's like, cool. When I finished that 9-month stint managing a team and having a manager reporting to me, I was having one of my, at the time, standard quarterly one-on-ones.
Existential crisis, you said, or you're?
No, I was having my quarterly one-on-one with Reed, which was typical for all directors back then.
Yeah.
And we were talking about my experience. And one of the things I said was like, yeah, I figured out I'm actually reasonably good at, I mean, I don't know all the things about being a people leader, but a lot of the things that I've been doing before that really do set me up to be able to do this role. And he was more or less, not his words exactly, but it was more or less, well, duh.
Yeah.
We have directors here. Some of them have people reporting them, some of them don't. But basically, in his mind, the shape of what it meant to be a director at Netflix was uniform, and the fact that you had people reporting to you or not was irrelevant.
So I guess we're at the end of the story of your career, but and we're also at time. And so if you're
Sure.
out of time or need to go eat, then that's cool too. But I would love to ask, what are the other things that you just would like, just an open mic? What are the major topics or your passion topics? What are the things that people in programming should know?
So I think in many ways I have largely fallen into the right-hand model of staff plus engineer that
Right.
Will Larson describes there. And that's led me to effectively do a bunch of things that I'd encourage you to put a few links at the end of this. You can put leadership pipeline, you can put that in. I'll plug Range by David Epstein at some point. There are often conversations about product leaders and engineering leaders sort of in a two-in-a-box style of leadership. And what I've realized is that to some extent, I've done that with the engineering leaders that I have reported to, that it's been a quasi two-in-a-box sort of thing.
Okay.
A lot of what I'm doing is off on the side, but it's very much using them as sounding boards, backstops for validating that I'm paying attention to the right sorts of things, et cetera.
Okay, and is that what? Because two in a box is something a term I'm not familiar with. What is?
Oh, So two in a box is a terminology that I've seen, as I say, usually applied to product managers and engineering managers, that they are collectively responsible for figuring out both the what and the what, when, and the timeline of how it's going to be done.
Right. Okay.
Sometimes they'll do the architecture of it, depending on what the role of engineering manager at a particular company is, but that they're sort of jointly responsible for that. And in some sense that they're, my perception, and I may have this wrong, but my perception is that they're effectively graded as a single unit.
Right. Okay. Yes. Co-leadership.
Co-leadership with its probably really, well, it's two in a box, it really is probably more that it's a Venn diagram with a lot of overlap, but because they each do have slightly different things that they're doing or responsible for. And the other thing that's makes it a little unclear is just what is my role right now, or maybe more relevantly, what is the next role that I might envision myself having? I think it could go be a principal engineer someplace. I think it could be a VP of engineering someplace. I think it could be a CTO someplace. I think it could be a technical program manager someplace. And as I said in the leadership community, I think I could be successful at any of those at the right company. And I think I could be ineffective and fail at any of them at the wrong company. And it's about matching the shape of what my skills are to what that is. Because of my interest in the business side of things and the leaders I've reported to who have been comfortable inviting me into that, I've been involved in some of those awkward conversations about whether we keep Alice or Bob, and why we might or might not, and compensation discussions and the like. And in some ways, I think that fits with Reed's articulation that you're a director. Well, okay. And I think that this comes down to company philosophy. One of my coworkers asked the somewhat rhetorical question of me in a one-on-one we had earlier this year around what kind of an organization do we want to be, and whether he was speaking of Netflix as a whole, engineering in particular, the particular piece of engineering that I'm in. Don't know, but I think that for me is really a fundamental question for any organization to answer about itself and how it wants to do that. And if you answer that, that will help you to start to structure organizational responsibilities. Do we want a PMO thing? Do we not? What are the sets of responsibilities that we're going to put in different ways? What are the ladders, how we transition those things? Those start to have an anchor point that you can use to build those things. And I'm becoming more and more aware that that's a collection of things that interests me. And that means, well, a variety of different people in different roles will be able to influence and participate in those. I don't see myself as having all the answers to any of those. So it's not the case that I feel like I have to be at the apex of the conversation. I just would like to be able to be part of that conversation and see if I can help an organization build something forward in an interesting and effective fashion.
Right. Okay. Well,
reading a bunch of Simon Sinek stuff recently, and it speaks a lot to me.
Which one? He was the one who did Start With Why, I believe, right?
Start With Why, The Infinite Game, and Leaders Eat Last. A bunch of his stuff is similar to, or perhaps inspired by, Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, I think is the title.
Okay. So those are more links for the bottom of the chat. Well, I've run out of questions. We've gone. This has been incredible. I think. I think it's really a great story. Really, some inspiring tidbits. Some real solid, learnable, teachable bits of information. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And I have really enjoyed it as well. So is there anything else you want to sign off with, or
maybe it will come across as trite, but start with your why. Start
Yeah.
with understanding what matters to you, what made sense for my journey and what makes sense for your journey is not necessarily the same thing. I found Range by David Epstein, the subtitle of it, which is Why Generalists Succeed in a Specialist World, to help me to understand myself a lot and how I integrate with the world. I'm fascinated by connecting the dots and trying to solve problems. I try to have some idea behind any question I ask, but I'm also just trying to learn things constantly because I don't know how I'm going to connect it together.
Yeah.
I have a few odd debugging stories that I still stick with me because it's like, I don't know how I knew to ask that question, but it came to me and it was useful when I asked the question. Yeah. Remember to enjoy the journey.
Yeah.
Because I had a boss, the boss who carried my resume into Netflix described me when we were working together at the first startup as being not really a startup kind of guy. And he's right in the sense that I don't have any particular interest in being fabulously wealthy. The only reason I see for that is to be a philanthropist. But I want to be able to enjoy life and that journey. And maybe that ties back to, for 18 years, what was my career definition? It was anchored in being an available
hanging
dad.
out with your kid. Yeah. I get that.
So those are the things that I suggest that can get lost along the way in talking about the tidbits of, well, what did you learn here? How did you go there? Find that theme and comfortable with that theme for you.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. And
my pleasure, Alex.
We'll talk to you again soon.
I look forward to it.
Okay.
Take care.
You too. Bye now.
Bye.